So how many defensive backs is too many? I mean, you can't take all the defensive backs in the recruiting class of 2024, can you? Pat Narduzzi and his coaching staff seem to believe that you can. Well, maybe not quite that much, but we'll talk about it today on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, it's Tuesday here on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. You know the deal. It's Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. I always emphasize that dash because it's weird to say it any other way. Most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com, and of course, message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans all day. Every day, Pitt fans are talking on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. And then we have our YouTube channel here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's a place to find all of our video content, these Morning Pitt videos every day of the week, Monday through Friday. The live show like we'll do tomorrow night at 8:30 p.m. every Wednesday night. Me and Jim Hammett get together and talk about whatever's going on in the world with Pitt sports. And then any other video features we might put here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You want to make sure you don't miss any of it. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribe button is right down there. And of course, like this video while you're here. Okay, defensive backs. How many can you really take in a class? Is there a ceiling? Is there a point at which it just becomes ridiculous? And if there is, are the Pitt coaches reaching it? So look into the commitment list right now. And, you know, we talked yesterday, we kind of play these games of who's committed, who's not, who announced, who hasn't. And we know they have 21 commitments. We know that 17 of those commitments have been announced. So there's still 4 outstanding commitments. Even with that being said, Pitt already has commitments from 5 defensive backs in the class of 2024. Tayshaun Banks was the first one. He committed in March. And since then, the first visit weekend produced Alan Bryant and Davion Pritchard commitments. And then this last visit weekend produced commitments from Nigel Maynard and Chasen Johnson. That's 5 defensive backs in this class. And there's a minor cornerback safety distinction there. But for the most part, these guys could play either one. Most of them are coming in to start at corner and then potentially could move to safety if it doesn't work out. And we've seen that trend develop over the years. I mean, you look at this, this incoming recruiting class right now. I think Jesse Anderson is a safety. Cruz Brookins is a safety, but Shadarian Harrison is a guy who's going to start off at corner but could easily move to safety. We've seen other guys make those moves over the years as well, and I think the staff likes guys with that kind of versatility. I mean, they like big corners, they like fast safeties, and so you want to find that kind of middle ground, the guys who can be big enough and fast enough and physical enough to play either spot and play it well. So you have some distinctions, you have some body types that are a little different. Some guys are better for this role or some guys are better for that role. But ultimately, I mean, when you see a Jordan Whitehead play both spots, I mean, he's not the biggest guy. He's pretty fast. He's pretty athletic. He's not the biggest guy. You wouldn't, he's not a guy that you would look at. I mean, if you recall, when Jordan Whitehead signed, we all thought he was a cornerback, right? But he gets to Pitt, in Pat Narduzzi's first year, and they move him to safety. He ends up playing strong safety for a year or two, piles up a bunch of tackles. I think he moved to field safety for his final season. But that just shows kind of how they want their DBs to be able to play. They want those guys to be cross-trained. And when you look at, this spring, a guy like Javon McIntyre is learning both safety spots. Stephon Hall, I think, could play both safety spots because they like that versatility. They're not pigeonholed and say, oh, we need to get a field safety out there and we need to get a boundary safety out there. They're in 2 separate groups. No, you got one group of safeties. And you find the 2 guys who go to bed work together the best on the field. So they like that versatility. So we can't even look at these 5 guys that are committed right now or the 5 guys that have announced their commitments right now and say, all right, well, it's 5, but 2 of them are corners and 3 are safeties or 3 and 2 or whatever it is. And so you kind of spread the numbers around like that. You can't really even look at it that way. It's 5 defensive backs, in a class of 17, so far. I mean, obviously, like I say, it's a class of 21, but we're talking about the 17 guys who have been announced. 5 of them are defensive backs. And it's funny because look, we know that this staff will always recruit a lot of DBs, and they have recruited a lot of DBs since they got here. It's never been something they shied away from. Sometime, I mean, it would be interesting to compare position-wise where they've signed the most numbers. I would not be surprised at all if since Pat Narduzzi's first recruiting class, they signed more defensive backs than any other position group, despite needing 5 offensive linemen on the field at all times and only 4 defensive backs. I wouldn't be surprised if they've signed more DBs than O linemen. We can go check the numbers, or somebody can go add that up and tell me what they come up with. Defensive line. I mean, you play 4 at one time, but you like to rotate. You like to have 8 guys ready to go at any one time. They probably signed more defensive backs than defensive linemen. They like to stockpile DBs, and we've seen that over the last 9 years. It's not a surprise at that point, but I think I was a little surprised when they went so heavy and have gone so heavy and seem intent on going so heavy this year with the 5 commitments that have already been announced. And then Coy Beasley, the probably the top guy on the board, who probably is just a safety and not a corner/safety, still out there as a heavy lean, I think, to Pitt that we can talk about as potentially being part of the class. Obviously after a really successful official visit weekend. So you're looking at, potentially 6 DBs in this class. Now, I think a few things. I think there might be a point this summer where Pitt has 6 defensive backs committed, but by the time we get to signing day in December, they might not sign those 6 defensive backs. I think there's always a possibility of decommitments. There's always a possibility of guys kind of backing off, flipping, getting dropped. I think all those things are in play. And they impacted the defensive back recruiting last year. Pitt signed 3 guys, Shadarian Harrison and Jesse Anderson and Cruz Brookins. But at one point, they also had commitments from Shelton Lewis and Bryce Pollock. And so, that was before Brookins. So they had 4 DBs committed at one point. They ended up signing only 3 because they lost those 2 guys and then added 1. So they were looking to take a few more guys last year, and they probably needed to add some more numbers this year just to kind of make up for it. Because if you roll back the clock a little bit, in 2021, they signed 6 defensive backs that year. Now, that was only 3 years ago. But then in 2022, they only signed 1, Rylan Gandy. It was a small class. I think only 13 guys signed. And Rylan Gandy was the lone defensive back in that class. So last year, I think they intended to sign maybe 4 or 5 if they could get them. They end up with only 3. So you're still trying to make up for that 2022 class, and you didn't really get the help that you needed out of last year's class, or you fell a little bit short of your goals in last year's class, and so you're going to go a little bit heavier this year. I think it's interesting when we look at the roster of defensive backs here, and I think this illustrates the point a little bit more of maybe why they needed to go heavier this year on DBs. At corner, I think we generally look at both positions and say they've got some solid depth. Some of it's unproven. They're going to be relying on 1 or 2 new starters here or there, particularly at safety. But there's pretty good depth. At corner, you've got MJ Devonshire, Marquez Williams, and AJ Woods. And that's a great top 3. And behind them, you have Rashad Battle, you have Noah Bigelow, you have Tamarian Crumpley, you have Gandy, who I just mentioned. You got a lot of corners who could step in there and play as, you're talking about the number 4 spot, behind those 3 seniors in Devonshire, Williams, and Woods, who should be really good again this year. Safety, you don't have any seniors, but you've got some upperclassmen. You've got Donovan McMillan, it's a transfer from Florida. You've got PJ O'Brien, who's a junior. You've got Stephon Hall and Javon McIntyre's redshirt sophomores. They'll be 3rd-year players this year. Potentially your starters right there. Buddy Mack is a redshirt junior. So you've got 5 sophomore or junior eligible players at safety. Pretty solid depth. But everything's pretty front-loaded there on the upper ends of the classes. So when you look at corner with Devonshire, Williams, and Woods, I mean, first of all, Williams and Woods are done. They can't come back after this year. They'll be super seniors this season. That's their final year of eligibility. Devonshire potentially could come back as a super senior in 2024. Sitting here, I would not expect that to happen. So you're going to go from having 3 senior corners to all those guys being gone. and you return like 5 guys. Rashad Battle, Noah Bigelow, Tamarian Crumpley, Rylan Gandy, and then Shadarian Harrison, who's coming in this year as a freshman. You get thin really quick. And if you're unsure about some of those guys in the middle of those classes, a Battle or a Bigelow or a Crumpley or a Gandy, and I'm not saying the coaches are or aren't. I think Bigelow was one of the leaders in spring camp in turnovers. Gandy has been praised ever since he arrived and really has probably been blocked a little bit. Probably would play more if not for, and be in position to play more if not for Devonshire, Williams, and Woods. But you kind of thin out real quickly when you have 8 corners and 3 of them are seniors. All it takes is one transfer or another guy leaving or something, and now your depth has been cut out pretty significantly. And not just for next year. And this is one of the things with recruiting that we often fall into. When you're looking at the recruiting class of 2024, you can't just think about how it impacts the roster for 2024. If you're looking at the roster now and saying, whoa, they're really thin at this position, they need to get a lot of guys for next year, you're already in trouble. You're already behind if you're recruiting to fill depth for the coming season. Ideally, you'd like to work, and I don't even know if this is possible anymore in 2023. This might be an outdated notion, but the idea of recruiting 3 years out, that you're recruiting to replace the guys who will be gone in 3 years. So that, in theory, these guys, the high school kids, the recruits come in, they practice for 2 years, maybe they're depth for 2 years, and then they're ready to step into a starting role after those guys cycle out. So that would be like replacing the middle classes, the Bigelow, the Crumpley, that area at corner, the Hall, the McIntyre, that area at safety. And again, it's a little bit outdated because a lot of these guys probably won't be at Pitt for the next 3 years. Either guys will leave early or they'll transfer or whatever it may be. But that old concept of recruiting 3 years out is really ideally what you'd be looking at. And so with that in mind, taking a big class of defensive backs in 2024 in this recruiting class of 2024 makes a lot of sense, because by the time you get to 2026, you're going to need a big group. You're going to lose. I mean, your Devonshire, Williams, and Woods are gone after this year. Battle could come back in 2025. He'd be a redshirt senior next year, 24. He could be a super senior in 25. And I lost it. So you get at least one more year out of him, and potentially 2. But after that, Bigelow, Crumpley, they have 25 and 26, and they're done. Gandy has 25, 26, 27, and he's done if they play out the full string of eligibility. So when you get to 2025, when you get to 26, you're only going to have 1 or 2 guys left from the current roster. And that means you're going to need this recruiting class of 2024 to fill it in. They're going to be needed, and it's the same way at safety. Buddy Mack, Donovan McMillan, PJ O'Brien, they're all junior eligible players here. You would think they have this year and probably one more year unless they transfer. Hall and McIntyre, Stephon Hall and Javon McIntyre, redshirt sophomores this year. They have 24, 25, 26. But by the time you get to that 26 season, you're going to need players to step in and be ready. They brought Jesse Anderson and Cruz Brookins in this, current freshman recruiting class, 2023 class, but you're going to need guys to fill it in. I didn't come into this recruiting cycle thinking defensive back was going to be a major area of need where they needed to, really restock and reload the position numbers. I thought receiver would be one that they'd have to get after. I thought offensive line, they would probably want to take a bigger class. Defensive tackle and defensive line as a whole, they've got youth there, but I thought they would want to reload a little bit there. Probably continue the rebuilding and reloading at linebacker. But I didn't really envision defensive back as being a position of need for numbers, but it really is because of where they're going to be 2 years from now and the guys who will be gone and the guys who will likely be back. And so I think that's why they're attacking it as they are and going so hard and trying to land so many DBs. Like I said, I think we conceivably could look at the commitment list at one point and see it was 6 defensive backs, which would, if they ended up signing 6, would tie for the most since 2021 when they signed Javon McIntyre, Noah Bigelow, Khalil Anderson, Stephon Hall, Tamarian Crumpley, and PJ O'Brien. They signed a bunch of guys that year, and as I talk about the 3 years out rule, that was the 21 class. This is the 24 class. 3 years later, they're kind of mimicking what they did. And if you want to dial it back even more, 21 back to 2018, they signed 4 guys that year. Still a bigger recruiting class. This group that they got, I think there's some pretty good players in here. We've talked about them as they committed. Nigel Maynard, a guy who chose Pitt over Michigan. Davian Pritchard, a playmaker at Austintown Fish. Chasen Johnson. I mean, are you going to argue with a 6'6", 180-pound defensive back from Florida? I'm not going to argue about that. Tayshawn Banks, really productive, a lot of interceptions, out in Cincinnati. And then Allen Bryant, St. Thomas Aquinas defensive back. Again, you're not going to argue with this staff taking a defensive back from Florida or Georgia, for that matter. But this is where they've gotten guys. They got 2 commitments already from Florida, in addition to a unique one from Tennessee and Nigel Maynard, and 2 guys from Ohio. Like I say, adding Coy Beasley to this group would be the real cherry on top. I mean, I think he's a huge priority for the staff, and I think they would love to get him. As a safety to come in, I think he's the number 1 safety target on the board for the Pitt staff right now, and he would really, I think, ice this thing. And the staff would say, okay, we're good with defensive backs for the time being. Now, if they were able to get to Ryan Nichols, the defensive back who visited over the weekend, who actually camped at Alabama yesterday and got an offer from the Tide, I have a hard time imagining that they would turn him down and say no, because he's a really good prospect, but at the same time, you do have to draw a line at some point. You do have to say, that's enough. We can't take any more DBs. Although, as we enter 2023, where there's almost sort of a built-in expectation that, somebody's probably going to decommit at some point. You maybe could get away with taking 1 or 2 extra, sort of thinking that probably somebody's not going to stick in there. The last thing I wanted to say is about how, and I probably should have led off with this, how it shouldn't be a surprise anymore. And I'm not sure, maybe it's not, but it shouldn't be a surprise anymore when this staff just sort of makes a killing with defensive back recruits. I mean, 8 defensive backs drafted under Pat Narduzzi. 8 guys who played for Pat Narduzzi since 2015 at Pitt, drafted all since 2018. And in the last 3 years, they've had 5 defensive backs drafted. Brandon Hill and Eric Hallett this year, Damari Mathis last year, and Jason Pinnock and DeMar Hamlin the year before. Probably won't be calling Pitt DBU because I don't think it gets in as much attention as it would need in order to earn that title or to receive that title. But I mean, it's just consistently turning out NFL prospects really year after year now. They've had somebody take a DB, at least 1 DB drafted in each of the last 4 drafts, and 5 out of the last 6. They're on a pretty good roll, and I would think, Marquez Williams, AJ Woods, MJ Devonshire, one of those guys, at least one of those guys will get drafted next year, and so that streak will stay alive. It'll be 5 years in a row of having a defensive back taken in the draft. And then if you want to play it down to the next year, you would like to think that a Stephon Hall or a Javon McIntyre or one of these guys might be ready to go and hear his name called as well. I mean, I think I guess what I'm saying is I think what they're building, I think it's creating it's a streak that should continue for a while. I think because they're recruiting well, they're developing well, and they're getting guys in the NFL, and that'll sort of self-perpetuate. As you continue putting guys into the NFL, I think you'll continue getting good recruits, and the whole process will just keep rolling. And, we've talked a lot about what this defense, the opportunities it presents for a defensive back, what it allows you to put on tape, how there's nowhere to hide in this defense. You either got it or you don't. And I think that's attractive to a certain a defensive back with a certain mentality will be attracted to playing in that kind of system with those kinds of challenges and that kind of opportunity. And so far they've got 5 guys already. And like I say, wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being 6 at some point who are willing to get on board and be a part of it. So that's the story with defensive backs. We'll keep talking recruiting all week because that's what we do. Don't forget, we have our live show tomorrow night at 8:30 p.m. right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and then all the coverage at Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Make sure you check it out and go to the message boards to talk to other Pitt fans at Panther-Lair.com. And then while you're here, like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We appreciate that. And we'll be back tomorrow for another exciting 20 minutes or so of talking about Pitt sports and Pitt recruiting. I'm sure we'll find plenty of recruiting topics to talk about. There's a commitment announcement coming out tomorrow, so we'll be keeping an eye on that, probably talking about that a little bit and then talking about it again on Thursday. And then we'll have lots to discuss, as always. It's June. There's always a lot of recruiting to discuss. So thanks for tuning in today. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hope you had a good Monday, and I hope you have a great Tuesday. We'll talk to you tomorrow on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.